This coming Saturday will mark 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, and the anniversary is, as you'd expect, prompting commentators to reflect on al-Qaeda's attacks on New York and Washington. In a speech to a London think tank today, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, said the threat posed by radical Islam was, if anything, getting worse.
In my view, Islamism, both the ideology and the violence, is a first-order security threat, and unchecked, it will come to us, even if centred far from us, as 9/11 demonstrated. We need also to assess our vulnerability. COVID-19 has taught us about deadly pathogens. Bioterror possibilities may seem like the realm of science fiction, but we would be wise now to prepare for their potential use by non-state actors.
Well, meanwhile, other commentators have been looking back at the historical lessons to be drawn from the bloody events of September the 11th, 2001. The historian Tim Stanley, writing in the Daily Telegraph today, said the attacks were not a bolt from the blue and might have been prevented. Let's turn to Tim Stanley now, who joins us, as you see. Hi to you, Tim. You mentioned in your column today that you'd been looking back at the 9/11 Commission, the report that was produced in the wake of 9/11. And they did make the point that though obviously a dreadful shock, it wasn't a complete surprise. This didn't come totally out of the blue.
That's correct. Reading it, I was struck, first of all, by how shockingly lax security was in 2001. The men who carried out the hijacking, some of them were actually flagged for extra security checks before they got on the plane.
They were setting off alarms as they went through.
They all went through metal detectors, and one of them set off a metal detector twice, which is astonishing. So first of all, security was very lax. Second of all, America really should have been on maximum alert. There were plenty of warnings that there was a potential terrorist attack, and there had been around a decade of terrorist attacks upon US personnel and US buildings in the run-up to that. Intelligence services were aware that al-Qaeda was attempting to gather nuclear materials in 1997. There had been al-Qaeda-backed attacks in 1998 on 2 US embassies. And in 2000, there was an appalling attack upon the USS Cole, which led to the deaths of 17 sailors. So in other words, really, they should have been aware of the possibility of this. Now, the report points out that what they were not prepared for, of course, was suicide bombings and the use of airplanes. So I'm not saying this was something that entirely could have been second-guessed, but certainly America should have been on high alert. One thing I'm really struck by is the continuity in issues and policy between Clinton and Bush. We tend to think of 9/11 being the beginning of a new chapter in history, and in many ways it was, because first of all, it exposed the shocking vulnerability of America, and it made the world suddenly feel small and very much scarier. But in many ways, there were the same problems predated 9/11, problems of terrorism, the problems of Saddam Hussein, of Iran, of Afghanistan, and in some ways, actually, the policy solutions were the same as well. 2003 was not the first time that America went to war with Iraq.
No. And you make the important distinction, and it's worth labouring, that actually the people, it's very easy to be introspective and to blame us for not spotting the problem as it comes down the track at us. But actually, at the end of the day, we were talking about 19 psychopaths who were religiously motivated.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, we are. And in the case of Osama bin Laden, he was insane. He was criminally insane. And actually, looking back over it, reading that report, thinking about the character of bin Laden, what he stood for, and how he attracted people and how he motivated, I think one of the real tragedies of the last 20 years is that there's been a debate within Western societies about whether or not we can live with Islam. We can. Osama bin Laden was not Islam, and he was considered among most Muslim communities as an extremist, the kind that hates other Muslims as much as he hated the so-called heretic. And some of his demands were, I wouldn't call them, the word rational perhaps might sound wrong, but they were demands that in theory could be negotiated over. Things like the Americans should remove bases from holy lands, or that America should stop financing Israel. But one of bin Laden's demands was that America convert to Islam, and of course to his version of Islam. And he was quite happy for Muslims to get killed in the course of killing Americans. So yes, that's very important. This was a death cult. It was extraordinary, and I think that part of it probably could not have been predicted.
No, and it's an important distinction point that you make. I remember after was it 2003, those dreadful Atocha train station bombings in Madrid carried out by Al-Qaeda, and there was a great clamour at the time, so, well, this is all because of what's been happening in Iraq and the fact that Spain was heading towards America's colours. And then, of course, the demands came out and said, actually, this is about the reconquest of Andalusia. It wasn't about what was happening in Israel or Gaza or indeed Iraq. It was other things. Just listening to Tony Blair's clip there, and, we've got to remind people, this is now 20 years ago, there'll be people who won't know, for instance, that Tony Blair was Prime Minister when 9/11 happened. And his reaction to it, nothing will ever be the same again, he famously said at the time. But in a sense, what you're saying, Tim, is actually there was this continuum that things had been the same. But surely, people will say, of course, the USS Cole, remember that, the bombing in Nairobi, but nothing on this scale, nothing which produced this visceral reaction and rage from the world superpower, which then demanded blood and vengeance.
Absolutely no, nothing on that scale at all. Nothing as sophisticated either, nothing as well planned had ever happened before. But listening to Blair, I'm really struck by how little changes. Tony Blair was trying to drive America to be more active in foreign policy and to project its power pre-2001. And one reason why America was slightly hamstrung when it came to dealing with Al-Qaeda in the late 90s was because policymakers felt they were overstretched in the Balkans and with containing Iraq. So both the fundamentalism and the problem of extremism within Islamic societies was present before 9/11, but so also were certain aspects of foreign policy. And it's so strange and in many ways frustrating, 20 years after 2001, after the evident policy failure of Afghanistan, to hear people talking in terms with policy ideas and approaches that are so similar to 2001. Now, I don't know what the alternative is. I'm not offering one. I just think it says something about the nature of this civilizational conflict, that we've not found better answers and we have the same problems.
Might part of the problem, Tim, be, I mean, you described bin Laden as a criminal psychopath. And I know Matthew Syed, writing in the Sunday Times yesterday, said, sometimes you just got to take people at their word. And I've observed over the years that there's an inclination, and it's a well-meaning inclination, to sometimes dismiss what are actually opinions which we find vile and offensive, but they're sincerely held by people of faith, a different faith from the one that you and I share, admittedly. But actually, there's a temptation to dismiss them as doolally. And actually, they're not. They've got a coherent worldview. It happens to be one I find objectionable. But to want to dismiss them as mad is folly.
Absolutely. We had to come to understand it. When you dismiss something as mad, the implication is it's also incompetent. It's never going to happen. There'll be no follow-through. Well, as 9/11 proved, that's not true. You can be a lunatic and be a tactical genius, although actually there were many errors in the carrying out of 9/11 in many ways. That's one of the reasons why it could have been prevented. But also you've got to see the connection between religion, politics, and military strategy. You mentioned this extraordinary idea that terrorists wanted to recreate Al-Andalusia. They wanted to recreate the glory years of early Islam when it even invaded and conquered much of Spain. That sounds bizarre, but it informs decision-making. The same was true with ISIS. The goal of ISIS was to create a tension, a conflict with the West, in order to trigger the apocalypse. When you're working on that kind of level, when you don't care about your own life, when the goal is actually to create a religious war that will lead to destruction, the purification of the world, then you're willing to take risks that Westerners aren't. And we have to understand that religious worldview if we're to understand the politics and also to understand the military strategy. And if you just dismiss the religious worldview, if you don't want to engage with it, then you're going to be taken by surprise.
Tim, just a final and brief thought as we approach Saturday's anniversary, 20th anniversary of 9/11. As an historian, there is a sense, isn't there, in which 20 years ago an event is just beginning to grow that little bit whiskery and to feel a bit more historical and a little less current affairs. And, I've talked to my children about 9/11 and they can look a little bit blank because it's not something which is readily discussed in the classroom, for instance. And I saw the footage for the first time in literally years of those dreadful images of the plane arrowing into one of the towers, and it still has that power to shock in a way that nothing else had done in life before. As an historian, what does the anniversary mean? What will it change in our thinking, if anything?
I was interviewed on this subject by someone who told me he was 1 year old when it happened. And that not only made me feel old, but it also brought home that there's a generation that have grown up in the shadow of 9/11. That generation, for as long as they've been alive, America was at war in Afghanistan in some form. So it cast a huge shadow over our generation. I think it also was a psychic shock. We now live in a very media-orientated visual age in which those images can be watched again and again and again. And in some ways, you can become numb to them. But in other ways, they're so powerful, so terrifying to see horror happen in real life to real people. But I think there's a consequence to that, to our society. We've lived with real-time murder on our screens. I think that's changed who we are. I really do.
Isn't it? Tim Stanley, historian and author who I ought to say has got an upcoming book, Whatever Happened to Tradition. Tim, thanks ever so much for your time. Thanks a lot.